14 men went into the Arkansas wilderness hunting one man. None of them came back alive. The year was 1863, and plantation records across 3 counties recorded the same name in their fugitive logs, a name that made seasoned trackers refuse assignments, that caused bounty hunters to demand double their usual fees, that turned the mere act of pursuit into a death sentence. Local authorities buried the incident so deep that for over a century, families of the deceased were told their men had simply vanished in the war. But the truth, locked away in courthouse basements and private collections, tells a different story, one of calculated violence, impossible survival, and a mathematical precision to killing that defied every assumption about what an escaped slave could accomplish. Before we continue with the story of the man they called the Reaper of Miller County, we need to understand the world that created him and the forces that transformed a piece of human property into the most efficient killer the Arkansas frontier had ever seen. Miller County, Arkansas, in the autumn of 1862, existed at the ragged edge of Confederate control. The county stretched along the Red River, its 60,000 acres divided among 43 plantations, each one a self-contained kingdom of cotton, timber, and human flesh. The Hutchins plantation, where our story begins, sprawled across 4,000 acres of bottom land. Rich, black soil that produced cotton so fine it fetched premium prices even as the war strangled southern commerce. The plantation house stood on a gentle rise, a 2-story structure of whitewashed cypress with 12 rooms and galleries that caught whatever breeze the summer heat allowed. But it was the quarters that defined the Hutchins property's true character. Not the typical slave cabins arranged in neat rows, but a compound system that owner Robert Hutchins had designed himself. 32 structures housed 214 enslaved people, organized by skill and value. The blacksmith shops, carpentry buildings, and tannery occupied the eastern section. The field hands lived in the western quarters, and in a separate compound, surrounded by its own fence, stood the punishment house. Robert Hutchins believed in systematic correction. He'd studied the writings of plantation management experts, corresponded with owners throughout the South, and developed what he called calibrated discipline, a methodology that matched infractions to specific consequences with scientific precision. He kept detailed records of every punishment administered, noting the implement used, the number of strokes, and the behavioral outcome. These ledgers, preserved in the Arkansas State Archives, reveal a mind obsessed with control, with reducing human beings to variables in an equation he believed he'd perfected. Among the enslaved population, one man stood apart, not through any special privilege, but through a quality that disturbed even the overseers who managed him. The plantation records list him only as Bass, purchased in 1856 from a Tennessee dealer for $900, an extraordinary sum that the ledger justified with a single annotation: unusual physical capabilities and mechanical aptitude. Bass stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a build that suggested not bulk but terrible efficiency. The kind of physique that came not from leisure but from years of labor that would have broken lesser men. He worked as a blacksmith and farrier, skills that gave him access to tools, to metal, to the practical knowledge of how things were made, and, more importantly, how they could be broken. The plantation's white blacksmith, a German immigrant named Otto Brenner, noted in a letter to his brother that Bass had a mind for mechanics that surpassed any craftsman I've known, regardless of station. He can look at a complex lock or mechanism and understand its workings instantly. It troubles me, though I cannot say why. What troubled Brenner was simple enough. Intelligence in a slave was dangerous, but intelligence combined with absolute silence was terrifying. Bass spoke only when directly addressed, answered in the minimum words required, and showed his owners a face that revealed nothing. The house slaves whispered that he'd learned this in Tennessee, that his previous owner had tried to break him using methods that left scars across his back like a map of suffering. But if that suffering had broken something in Bass, it wasn't his will. It was whatever capacity he might have had for mercy. He'd been at Hutchins' plantation for 6 years when the war broke out. While other slaves whispered excitedly about Union armies and freedom, Bass remained silent. While others were caught attempting escape and subjected to Hutchins' calibrated discipline, Bass showed no inclination to run. He shod horses, repaired tools, crafted hinges and chains and shackles with hands that never trembled, eyes that never met those of the white men who supervised his work. Robert Hutchins believed he'd found the perfect slave. Talented, obedient, seemingly content within the boundaries of his existence. He had no idea he was looking at a man who'd spent 6 years studying every inch of the plantation, memorizing patrol schedules, cataloging weapons, and preparing for a moment that would require perfect timing and absolute ruthlessness. That moment came on November 3, 1862, when Hutchins made the mistake of taking Bass with him to the county seat. The trip to Texarkana should have been routine, a quarterly journey to handle legal matters, purchase supplies, and maintain the social connections that kept plantation society functioning. Hutchins brought Bass to handle the horses and assist with loading heavy items. What Hutchins didn't know was that Bass had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, to be off the plantation, in a town where multiple roads offered escape routes, where the chaos of wartime made unusual movements less suspicious. The day proceeded normally until mid-afternoon, when Hutchins stopped at the county courthouse to file paperwork related to a property dispute. He left Bass with the wagon on the street, a decision that would have been unthinkable before the war, but had become common as white labor grew scarce. The usual crowd of merchants, soldiers on leave, and farmers conducting business filled the streets. No one paid particular attention to one more slave standing by a wagon. What happened next unfolded so quickly that witnesses could barely reconstruct the sequence. Hutchins emerged from the courthouse around 4 o'clock, papers in hand, discussing something with the county clerk. He walked toward the wagon, still talking, and reached for the driver's bench. Bass stood beside the wagon, head bowed, posture submissive. Then, in a movement that Otto Brenner would later recognize as similar to how Bass struck hot metal on an anvil, with perfect economy and devastating force, Bass picked up a bundle of iron chains from the wagon bed and swung them in a wide arc that caught Hutchins across the side of the head. The clerk's testimony, given under oath 3 days later, stated that Hutchins dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Bass didn't pause to confirm the results. He dropped the chains, grabbed a coil of rope and a burlap sack from the wagon, and vaulted onto the driver's bench. Before anyone in the street could fully process what they'd witnessed, he had the horses moving at a canter that quickly became a gallop, heading east on the road that led toward the deep timber country along the Sulphur River. The clerk ran into the street shouting for help. People rushed to where Hutchins lay in the dust, blood pooling around his head. A physician examined him and pronounced that he still lived, though barely. Someone fired a rifle shot, the traditional signal that a slave had run. Within minutes, the alarm had spread through Texarkana like fire through dry grass. By sunset, 18 men had assembled at the courthouse, a mixture of plantation overseers, professional slave catchers, and opportunistic bounty hunters drawn by the $300 reward Robert Hutchins's brother posted from his bed, where he lay with a cracked skull and uncertain prospects. The group organized itself under the leadership of a man named William Taggart, a slave catcher with a reputation for never losing a fugitive. Taggart had spent 20 years pursuing runaways through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. He owned 6 dogs, savage animals trained to track and immobilize, and carried a modified shotgun loaded with rock salt, designed to cause agonizing pain without killing valuable property. But Taggart made a critical error in judgment that night. He assessed Bass as a typical fugitive, desperate, panicked, making decisions driven by fear rather than calculation. He divided his 18 men into 3 groups. 6 men would follow the road east. 6 would take a parallel route through the timber. The remaining 6, including Taggart himself, would circle north and position themselves to intercept Bass when he inevitably tried to cross into Indian territory, where runaway slaves often sought refuge. It was a sound strategy for pursuing a frightened fugitive. Against Bass, it was suicide. The first body was discovered 48 hours after Bass disappeared. A farmer found it in a ravine 3 miles off the main road, a man named Douglas Patterson, one of the 6 who'd taken the timber route. Patterson had been strangled with such force that his larynx was crushed. His rifle, pistol, and knife were missing. More disturbing was the positioning of the body, deliberately placed where it would be visible from a game trail, arranged with arms outstretched, as if in warning. William Taggart's group found the body around noon on November 5th. Taggart examined the scene with the careful attention of a man whose survival depended on reading signs. What he saw troubled him enough that he sent 2 men back to Texarkana with a message requesting additional help and bloodhounds. The remaining men in his group, himself and 3 others, pressed forward, following what Taggart believed was Bass's trail heading northeast. They made camp that night in a clearing beside a creek, maintaining a careful watch. The 3 men took turns standing guard while the others slept, rifles loaded and ready. Taggart woke at dawn to find one of his men missing. They found him 20 yards from camp, dead from what the subsequent inquest would describe as manual strangulation with evidence of struggle. His weapons were gone. So was his ammunition. That was when Taggart realized he wasn't pursuing a fugitive. He was being hunted. The revelation came too late. Over the next 4 days, 11 more men died in the Arkansas wilderness. The second group of 6, following the road east, was found scattered across 3 miles of territory. 3 had been strangled. 2 had died from what appeared to be blunt force trauma, killed by rocks or wooden clubs. 1 had drowned in 4 feet of water in a creek, held under with methodical patience. Their weapons had vanished. Their ammunition pouches were empty. The pattern emerged slowly, pieced together by the county sheriff and a former army officer brought in to make sense of the massacre. Bass wasn't running. He was conducting a systematic campaign of elimination, using tactics that suggested military training or natural strategic genius. He'd studied his pursuers' methods, anticipated their movements, and turned their own strategies against them. The division into smaller groups, meant to cover more territory, had made them vulnerable. Bass picked them off individually or in pairs, using darkness and terrain to his advantage. More disturbing were the details that emerged from examining the bodies and the kill sites. Bass had constructed deadfalls and snares along likely approach routes, traps that showed sophisticated understanding of weight distribution and trigger mechanisms. He'd stolen horses from 2 of the groups, using them to move quickly between locations before releasing them to muddy his trail. Most unnervingly, he'd apparently concealed himself in close proximity to his pursuers for extended periods, observing their habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. William Taggart died on November 9th, found by a search party that had finally brought competent trackers and sufficient numbers. 23 men with military experience and proper coordination. Taggart had been killed in his bedroll, strangled while his companions slept 15 feet away. The killer had entered and exited the camp without alerting the sentries or the dogs. The weapons taken from Taggart included a particularly fine rifle and 2 pistols, adding to an arsenal that Bass had been systematically accumulating. The search party that found Taggart's body included a former Confederate officer named Captain James Hardesty, who'd been recalled from service specifically to lead the manhunt. Hardesty examined the scene with the eye of someone who'd seen combat. His report to the county commissioners, preserved in the Arkansas Historical Society archives, includes this assessment. The fugitive demonstrates tactical sophistication beyond that of most soldiers I've commanded. He shows patience, planning ability, and a willingness to take calculated risks. Most significantly, he shows no hesitation in killing, suggesting either complete moral detachment or a level of rage that has burned away normal human constraints. I believe we're dealing with someone who has decided his only options are victory or death, and has chosen to make his pursuers pay the highest possible price for his capture. By mid-November, Bass Reeves, for so the population had begun calling him, adding a surname that meant bailiff or steward, a bitter irony considering his systematic execution of those who represented law and order, had killed 14 men. The $300 reward had grown to $500, then $700, but professional slave catchers were refusing the assignment. Rumors spread through plantation communities. Some said Bass had military training from serving a previous owner who'd been an officer. Others claimed he'd learned tracking from Native Americans. A few whispered that he'd made a pact with darker forces, that no natural man could move so silently or kill so efficiently. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Bass had spent 6 years in absolute silence, watching and learning, converting every observation into practical knowledge. He'd studied how patrols moved, how trackers worked, how men thought when they believed themselves superior. He'd worked metal in a forge, learning about strength and breaking points, about leverage and force. And somewhere in those 6 years, he'd made a decision that whatever happened after escape, whoever came after him, would learn that treating a human being as property came with a cost, measured in blood. The military eventually became involved, not officially, but through Confederate officers on leave who saw the manhunt as an opportunity to maintain discipline among the enslaved population. If one escaped slave could kill 14 pursuers with impunity, what message did that send to the hundreds of thousands still held in bondage throughout the South? Captain Hardesty was joined by 2 other officers, and together they assembled a force of 32 men, former soldiers with combat experience, armed with military-grade weapons, and organized into a proper tactical formation. They spent 2 weeks searching the territory between the Red River and the Sulphur, using methods developed in warfare against Native American tribes, systematic sweeps, coordinated movements, and camp security that involved multiple sentries and defensive positions. They found signs of Bass's presence, cold campfires, evidence of game being dressed and cooked, tracks that suggested he was moving in a wide circuit through the region. But the man himself remained invisible, a ghost who left traces but never appeared. The truth that Hardesty's journals reveal, documents donated to the Arkansas Military History Museum by his descendants, is that Bass was conducting a different kind of war. While the search parties scoured the wilderness, he was moving along the periphery of civilization, approaching isolated farmsteads and small settlements under cover of darkness. He wasn't seeking confrontation. He was gathering intelligence. On November 28th, Bass appeared at a small farm operated by a free black family named the Rayburns, 10 miles south of the main search area. The family's account, recorded decades later, describes a man who emerged from the darkness, carrying weapons that identified him as dangerous, but whose demeanor suggested control rather than desperation. He asked for food and information. The Rayburns, terrified but unwilling to turn away someone who might have been their son or brother in different circumstances, gave him cornbread and dried meat. During the meal, Bass spoke more words than he'd apparently spoken in months. He asked about patrol routes, about which families might shelter a fugitive, about the location of the nearest Union Army units. The war was turning. Even in remote Arkansas, people knew that Union forces controlled key positions along the Mississippi. Freedom, if it could be found, lay to the east, beyond the reach of Confederate law. The Rayburns told Bass about a settlement of refugee slaves along the Arkansas-Louisiana border, a precarious community protected by Union gunboats on the river. They warned him the journey was over 100 miles through hostile territory, past dozens of plantations and military outposts. Bass listened, thanked them, and disappeared back into the darkness. But he didn't head east. Instead, he turned back toward Miller County, toward the territory where the search parties were concentrated. Hardesty's journals express bafflement at this decision. Every tactical consideration suggested Bass should flee as quickly and as far as possible. Why would he return to the area of greatest danger? The answer became clear on December 3rd, when the Hutchins plantation was attacked. The assault occurred around midnight, when most of the plantation's population, enslaved and free, were sleeping. Bass approached from the east, moving through cotton fields that were chest-high and dry. He'd apparently been observing the plantation for several nights, studying routines and security measures that had grown lax in his absence. The overseer, A man named Harold Vickers maintained a night watch. 3 white men with rifles who patrolled the compound areas. Bass avoided them entirely, circling to the stables where the plantation's horses were kept. What followed was later reconstructed from physical evidence and accounts from enslaved witnesses who saw portions of the events. Bass set fire to the stable, using materials he'd apparently prepared in advance. Oil-soaked rags and kindling positioned to create maximum flame spread. The fire caught quickly, spreading through the dry wood structure and panicking the horses trapped inside. The night watch responded immediately, running toward the flames. So did others roused by the noise. Overseers, the plantation manager, even Robert Hutchins himself, recovered from his head wound, but still weak. In the chaos and darkness, with everyone's attention focused on the burning stable and the screaming horses, Bass moved through the plantation compound with apparent specific purpose. He went to the punishment house. The structure had been locked from the outside, standard practice, to prevent anyone inside from leaving until their sentence was complete. 2 people were being held there that night, accused of stealing food and awaiting morning discipline. Bass broke the lock with tools he'd brought, opened the door and spoke briefly to those inside. Then he moved to the overseer's quarters, a small building near the main house. Harold Vickers had run toward the stable fire like everyone else, but he'd apparently realized something was wrong and doubled back. He encountered Bass in the darkness between buildings. What happened next was heard by multiple witnesses, but seen by none. Sounds of struggle, a shout cut short, then silence. Vickers' body was found at dawn, strangled like Bass's previous victims. Beside him lay a branding iron, the same implement he'd used countless times to mark runaways who'd been recaptured. The iron had been placed across Vickers's chest, cold but positioned with obvious symbolic intent. By the time the fire was extinguished and order restored, Bass had vanished. So had 6 enslaved people from the Hutchins plantation, including the 2 he'd freed from the punishment house. They disappeared into the darkness, following a man who demonstrated that while escape was costly, the price could be paid in enemy blood rather than fugitive terror. The attack on Hutchins' plantation transformed Bass Reeves from a fugitive into something approaching myth. Throughout Miller County and beyond, the enslaved population whispered about the man who'd killed those who hunted him, who'd returned to free others, who moved through the landscape like smoke. The white population responded with increasing paranoia. Patrols doubled and tripled. Slave catchers demanded outrageous fees. Plantation owners slept with loaded weapons beside their beds. But the Confederate authorities faced a dilemma. The war was consuming men and resources. Every soldier dedicated to hunting one fugitive was a soldier not fighting Union forces. And Bass had now demonstrated that pursuit meant casualties. The 14 men he'd killed represented a significant loss for a county that had already sent most of its able-bodied white men to military service. Captain Hardesty proposed a different approach. Rather than continuing active pursuit, his strategy involved establishing a perimeter and waiting. Bass had to eat, had to find shelter, had to eventually move toward Union lines if he truly wanted freedom. Hardesty positioned his forces at key river crossings and along major roads. He coordinated with neighboring counties, creating a network of checkpoints and patrols designed to catch Bass when he inevitably attempted to travel east. For 3 weeks in December, the strategy seemed to work. There were no sightings, no attacks, no signs of Bass's presence. Hardesty believed the fugitive was holed up somewhere, possibly wounded, definitely running low on supplies. Winter was setting in. Cold, rainy weather that made outdoor survival increasingly difficult. Time, Hardesty believed, was now working against Bass. He was wrong. Bass hadn't stopped moving. He'd adapted his strategy, recognizing that the systematic pursuit had been replaced by a containment effort. Rather than avoiding detection through wilderness skills alone, he began using the enslaved population's informal communication network, the grapevine telegraph, that transmitted information between plantations through field hands, house servants, and the few free black people who could travel with relative freedom. Through this network, Bass learned about patrol schedules, checkpoint locations, and the identification papers that free black people carried. On December 18th, a free black farmer named Samuel Hayes reported to authorities that his papers had been stolen from his home while he worked his fields. The theft seemed minor. Such papers could be replaced, but it represented something more significant. Bass now had documentation that would let him move along roads in daylight, reducing his dependence on wilderness travel. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Miller County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. On December 22nd, Bass crossed the Sulphur River at a point 10 miles north of Captain Hardisty's picket line. He'd spent days observing the patrols, timing their movements, identifying the gap in coverage that existed for approximately 40 minutes each afternoon when shift changes occurred. He traveled as Samuel Hayes, carrying stolen papers and leading a horse he'd taken from an isolated farm. Anyone who saw him saw a free black man going about legitimate business. By December 24th, he was 40 miles east of Miller County, well beyond the practical range of pursuit. He'd entered territory contested between Confederate and Union forces, where authority was fragmented and enforcement inconsistent. The 6 people he'd freed from Hutchins' plantation were scattered across the region. He'd split them up, deliberately, knowing that a single large group of fugitives would attract attention, but individuals might slip through. Bass himself continued east, moving toward the Mississippi River and the Union positions beyond. He traveled at night when possible, stayed in free black communities when he could find them, and showed the same patience and calculation that had kept him alive through 2 months of being the most hunted man in Arkansas. On January 7th, 1863, he reached Union lines, specifically a camp of the 3rd United States Colored Troops operating in eastern Arkansas. The regiment's records, preserved in the National Archives, include an entry from that date noting the arrival of a refugee from slavery who reported the deaths of 14 pursuers during his escape. The commanding officer, Colonel Samuel Thompson, interviewed Bass personally and recorded his impressions. An individual of unusual capability and complete self-possession, shows no remorse for the men he killed, which he describes as necessary military action against combatants attempting his capture. When asked if he felt guilt, he stated, "I feel what any soldier feels after battle, relief at survival and satisfaction at completing the mission." His mission, apparently, was to acquire his freedom through force of arms, having concluded that peaceful escape was impossible. The Union Army offered Bass enlistment, which he accepted. He served for the remainder of the war in various capacities: scout, intelligence gatherer, and eventually soldier. His military records describe competent service, but note that he rarely spoke about his experiences before reaching Union lines. After the war, he disappeared from historical record, one of millions of freed people who scattered across the nation seeking new lives. But that disappearance wasn't immediate, and the years between 1863 and 1865 revealed dimensions of Bass Reeves that even his flight through Arkansas hadn't fully exposed. The Union Army didn't simply accept escaped slaves into their ranks without scrutiny, particularly those who arrived with stories of killing 14 pursuers. Colonel Thompson's initial interview with Bass was followed by 3 more, conducted by different officers, each one probing for inconsistencies or signs of exaggeration. What emerged from those interviews, documented in reports that military historians discovered in the 1970s, was a detailed account that remained consistent across all tellings. Bass described each killing methodically, the location, the circumstances, the tactical considerations that led to his approach. He sketched maps from memory showing where bodies could be found. He listed the weapons he'd taken and explained how he'd modified some of them for better concealment or efficiency. The officers conducting the interviews reached a unanimous conclusion, stated explicitly in a report dated January 15, 1863. This individual is neither boastful nor remorseful. He describes acts of lethal violence with the detachment of a craftsman explaining his work. We assess him as highly capable, potentially valuable for irregular operations, and completely reliable within the scope of assigned duties. We also assess him as someone who should never be given reason to consider us enemies. That last observation proved prophetic. Bass was assigned to a scout unit operating in contested territory, the fluid zone between Confederate and Union control, where information was currency and survival depended on reading situations quickly. Scout work suited his capabilities perfectly. He moved through landscapes populated by people who looked like him, spoke his language, and had every reason to help Union forces, but also every reason to fear Confederate reprisals. Bass's ability to appear and disappear, to read people and situations, to make decisions without hesitation, all the skills he'd developed during his flight, translated directly into military effectiveness. His service record includes commendations from 3 different commanding officers. One, dated July 1863, notes, Corporal Reeves located and mapped Confederate supply depot coordinates that resulted in successful cavalry raid. Entered hostile territory alone, gathered intelligence through observation and conversation with local colored population, returned with actionable information that proved completely accurate. Another, from March 1864. Corporal Reeves volunteered for reconnaissance mission considered extremely high risk. Returned with intelligence on troop movements that allowed reposition of artillery, likely preventing significant casualties in subsequent engagement. But there was another dimension to Bass's wartime service that didn't appear in official records, a dimension that only emerged decades later through interviews with other veterans of the United States colored troops. Bass apparently maintained contact with the network of escaped slaves and free black people throughout Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. He used his missions to pass information to plantation slaves about Union positions, safe routes to freedom, and the changing military situation. More significantly, he occasionally undertook unauthorized missions with objectives that had nothing to do with military intelligence and everything to do with settling accounts. A veteran named Isaiah Washington, interviewed in 1903 for a project documenting Black Civil War service, described an incident from autumn 1863. Bass had returned from a reconnaissance mission and learned that a slave catcher named Robert Chenoweth was operating in the area. One of the professional hunters who'd specialized in pursuing fugitives into Union-controlled territory and returning them to Confederate owners for substantial fees. Chenoweth had a reputation for brutality that exceeded even the standards of his profession. He'd apparently been involved in the initial pursuit of Bass back in Miller County, though he'd avoided the fate of the 14 men because he'd been away on another assignment when Bass made his systematic eliminations. Washington's account describes Bass leaving camp without authorization one evening, carrying only a knife and moving with clear purpose. He returned 3 days later saying nothing about where he'd been. A week after that, word reached the Union camp that Chenoweth had been found dead in his camp, strangled in his sleep, his dogs poisoned, his weapons and papers taken. No one ever officially connected Bass to the killing, but Washington recalled, "We all knew." The way he sat quiet that morning when the news came, cleaning his rifle with hands that never trembled. We knew. And none of us said a word, because Chenoweth had dragged more than 60 people back to slavery, and whatever happened to him in the darkness was justice of a kind that courts and laws wouldn't provide. This pattern apparently repeated several times during the war. Men who'd participated in slave catching, overseers known for particular cruelty, Confederate officers who'd ordered executions of captured black soldiers. They occasionally turned up dead in circumstances that suggested professional execution rather than combat casualties. Military investigators looked into some of these deaths, but in the chaos of war, with casualties mounting and priorities focused elsewhere, and dead slave catcher or brutal overseer didn't warrant extensive investigation. The clearest evidence of Bass's private war emerged from documents in the Miller County Courthouse, discovered during a renovation in 1992. Among old tax records and property deeds, researchers found a journal kept by James Hutchins, Robert Hutchins' younger brother, who'd managed what remained of the plantation after Robert's injury. The journal covers the years 1863 through 1865 and includes periodic references to the Reeves matter and concerns about security. In an entry dated November 1863, exactly 1 year after Bass's escape, James Hutchins wrote, "Harold Vickers' brother Thomas arrived today, asking questions about the circumstances of Harold's death. He's heard rumors from soldiers returning from eastern Arkansas, stories about a colored scout with the Union Army who matches descriptions of our former property. Thomas believes Harold's killer is not only alive but actively serving our enemies. He wants to pursue the matter, but I've counseled him against it. 14 men pursued Reeves and none returned. Thomas Vickers, whatever his grief, would be a 15th corpse. Some debts must remain uncollected because the cost of collection exceeds any possible benefit." But Thomas Vickers didn't take that advice. Documents from Union Army records show that in January 1864, a civilian was captured near Union lines carrying a loaded rifle and papers identifying him as Thomas Vickers of Miller County, Arkansas. He claimed to be a Confederate sympathizer gathering intelligence, but under interrogation, he admitted he was looking for a specific individual, a Union scout named Bass Reeves, whom he believed had killed his brother. The interrogation report, signed by Colonel Thompson himself, describes what happened next. The prisoner was confronted with Corporal Reeves in controlled circumstances. Upon seeing Reeves, the prisoner became agitated and made accusations regarding the death of his brother Harold Vickers, whom Reeves allegedly killed during escape from slavery. Corporal Reeves confirmed the killing, stating, "Your brother participated in pursuing me with intent to return me to bondage or kill me in the attempt. I defended myself using means available. If you wish to pursue the same course your brother chose, you'll meet the same end. Otherwise, you have the opportunity he lacked, the opportunity to walk away and live." The prisoner was subsequently transported to Prisoner Exchange Point and released to Confederate custody. Whether Thomas Vickers took Bass's advice or not remains unknown. His name doesn't appear in subsequent military records, and he's listed in Confederate pension applications after the war, suggesting he survived. But the incident reveals something crucial about Bass's psychology during this period. He wasn't hiding from his past. He owned what he'd done completely, without apology or justification beyond the simple logic of self-defense and survival. As the war entered its final year, Bass's reputation within the colored troops had grown to near legendary status. New recruits heard stories about the man who'd killed 14 slave catchers during his escape. Veterans who'd served with him told different stories about his patience on reconnaissance, his ability to move through hostile territory, his habit of sitting silent through conversations until someone asked him a direct question, at which point he'd provide a concise, accurate answer and return to silence. That silence extended to his personal history. Despite serving alongside hundreds of other men who'd escaped slavery, Bass never spoke about his life before November 1862. Other soldiers shared stories of families left behind, of owners they'd served, of the routes they'd taken to freedom. Bass offered nothing. When directly asked, he'd deflect with variations of, "That life ended when I took the chains off Hutchins' wagon." What matters is what comes next. What came next, as the war ended in April 1865, was a choice faced by 4 million newly freed people. Where to go, what to do, how to build lives in a nation that had defined them as property for 2.5 centuries. For many veterans of the colored troops, the choice involved staying near where they'd served, taking advantage of land opportunities or military connections. For Bass, the choice apparently involved complete separation from his past. The last definitive military record of Bass Reeves is dated June 18, 1865, a discharge certificate noting completion of service and providing basic physical description. Bass Reeves, colored, age approximately 35 years, height 6 feet 2 inches, identifying marks including scars on back consistent with whipping. Served with distinction in 3rd United States Colored Troops from January 1863 through June 1865. Commended for reconnaissance work and intelligence gathering. Authorized for veterans' pension upon reaching appropriate age. After that date, the historical record becomes fragmented, scattered mentions in documents that may or may not refer to the same individual. A B. Reeves appears in an 1867 Memphis City directory listed as a blacksmith. A Bass Reeves is mentioned in an 1870 newspaper from Fort Smith, Arkansas, describing a dispute over property rights. Another Bass Reeves shows up in 1875 Oklahoma Territory records as a deputy U.S. Marshal, though some historians dispute whether this is the same person who escaped from Miller County 12 years earlier. What's documented beyond dispute are the reverberations of his story through the communities most affected by it. In Miller County, the white population dealt with the Bass Reeves incident through collective amnesia. The 14 dead men were rarely mentioned. The circumstances of their deaths were simplified or obscured. Family members who knew the truth kept it private, sharing it only in guarded conversations with those who'd understand the shame of having lost fathers or brothers to someone they'd been taught to consider inherently inferior. But the formerly enslaved population throughout Arkansas and surrounding states preserved every detail. The story was told and retold, often embellished but maintaining its essential core. One man had refused to accept bondage, had fought with systematic efficiency, had killed everyone sent to recapture him, and had walked away to freedom. In churches and family gatherings, in the quiet moments when elders spoke to youth, the story served multiple purposes. It was inspiration, proof that resistance was possible. It was warning, freedom came with terrible costs. And it was testament to a truth that slavery's defenders had desperately tried to suppress, that intelligence, capability, and deadly competence existed independent of skin color or social status. The psychological impact on those who'd known Bass personally was particularly profound. Otto Brenner, the German blacksmith who'd worked alongside Bass at Hutchins Plantation, gave an interview to a Memphis newspaper in 1871. In it, he reflected on the 6 years he'd spent teaching Bass advanced blacksmithing techniques. I believed I was training a valuable worker. I didn't understand I was arming a weapon. Every skill I taught him, how to analyze a lock's mechanism, how to assess metal strength, how to use leverage for maximum force, he absorbed and cataloged for future use. When I learned what he'd done after escaping, my first reaction was horror. My second was professional admiration. He'd taken theoretical knowledge and applied it with practical genius under conditions that would have broken most men. My third reaction, which haunts me still, is recognition that if I had been in his position, subjected to what he'd endured, I would have done exactly the same things, or tried to, though I doubt I'd have survived as he did. The documents that tell Bass Reeves's complete story are scattered across dozens of archives, courthouse basements, and private collections. Assembling them requires the kind of patient, systematic work that Bass himself demonstrated during his escape, gathering individual pieces, analyzing how they fit together, recognizing patterns that reveal larger truths. The effort is complicated by deliberate obfuscation. Officials in Miller County and surrounding areas apparently made conscious decisions to minimize documentation of the incident, recognizing that detailed records would serve as permanent evidence of their failure to recapture one escaped slave, despite devoting extraordinary resources to the pursuit. But absence of documentation tells its own story. The Miller County Sheriff's records for November and December 1862 show an unusual gap. Routine reports resume in January 1863 without any explanation for the missing weeks. The county commissioners' meeting minutes from that period mention expenses related to fugitive recovery, but provide no details about the fugitive, the recovery efforts, or the outcomes. Tax records show 14 death certificates filed between November and December 1862, but the causes of death are listed generically as misadventure, accident, or simply deceased. The families of the dead men, however, kept their own records. Estate settlements, property transfers, and pension applications documented in state archives reveal the human cost of the pursuit. Douglas Patterson, the first man killed, left a wife and 3 children who lost their farm within 2 years of his death, unable to maintain it without his labor. William Taggart's widow filed for a Confederate pension in 1868, claiming hardship based on her husband's death in service to the state. The application was denied because Taggart hadn't been formally enlisted in military service. Slave catching, however dangerous, didn't qualify for veteran benefits. The collective economic impact on Miller County was substantial. 14 men represented a significant portion of the county's law enforcement and labor management capacity. Their deaths, combined with the disruption caused by Bass's attack on Hutchins' plantation, contributed to a breakdown in plantation discipline that accelerated as Union forces gained control of Arkansas. Enslaved people who'd heard about Bass's successful escape and violent resistance began their own escape attempts. Some succeeded. Others were caught and subjected to punishments that grew increasingly severe as owners tried desperately to maintain control over property that understood it would soon be freed. Robert Hutchins never recovered from the trauma of Bass's attack. Medical records from a Memphis physician, preserved in that city's medical archives, described treating Hutchins in 1864 for symptoms that included persistent headaches, memory problems, and paranoid anxiety. The physician's notes describe a man convinced that his former property will return to complete the work started with the chain strike. Patient maintains loaded weapons at all times, starts at sudden sounds, and reports difficulty sleeping. Physical examination shows healed skull fracture with possible permanent damage to brain tissue. Psychological condition appears rooted in assault trauma, combined with recognition that social order he'd assumed permanent is collapsing around him. Hutchins sold his plantation in March 1865, taking a substantial loss because buyers recognized that slave-based agriculture was ending. He moved to Texas, purchased a small farm, and died in 1869, according to his death certificate, from complications of old head injury. His obituary in the Tyler, Texas newspaper made no mention of how he'd received that injury, describing him simply as a former Arkansas planter who'd relocated after the recent unpleasantness. The Hutchins plantation property itself underwent transformation that reflected the broader changes sweeping through the South. During Reconstruction, portions were sold to formerly enslaved people through programs designed to redistribute land. By 1870, the 4,000-acre plantation had been divided into 37 small farms, most operated by black families. The plantation house was purchased by a northern teacher who'd come south to establish a school for freed people. The slave quarters were torn down, their materials reused to build new structures. And the punishment house, that building where Bass had freed 2 people during his midnight raid, was burned in a ceremony that descendants of those involved described as necessary cleansing of cursed ground. Physical evidence of Bass's journey through Arkansas occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways. In 1873, a farmer clearing land near the Sulphur River discovered a cache of weapons buried in a hollow tree. 3 rifles, 2 pistols, ammunition, and a knife, all wrapped in oiled cloth. The weapons matched descriptions of those taken from the men Bass killed, suggesting he'd hidden them as he moved toward Union lines, unable to carry everything but unwilling to leave them where they might be found and used against others seeking freedom. In 1889, construction workers excavating for a new courthouse in Texarkana unearthed what appeared to be a prepared campsite. A depression in the ground covered with cut branches, positioned to provide concealment while offering views of the surrounding area. Among the remnants were fragments of leather that might have been from shoes or bags, fire-hardened stones that could have been used for cooking, and metal fragments that might have been tools. Local historians speculated this might have been one of Bass's hiding places during his flight, though conclusive proof was impossible. The most significant discovery occurred in 1938 when a descendant of Otto Brenner donated his ancestors' papers to the Arkansas State Historical Society. Among them was a letter Brenner had written but apparently never sent, dated December 1862. In it, he reflected on Bass's escape and the subsequent killings. "I am troubled by what Bass has done, yet I cannot condemn him. For 6 years I worked alongside him, teaching him skills while remaining ignorant of the man I was teaching. He never complained, never showed anger, never gave any indication of the calculations proceeding behind his eyes. Now I understand that silence was survival strategy. Any word, any expression, any moment of inattention could have triggered the kind of attention that made life unbearable. So he presented a mask of compliance while observing everything, learning everything, preparing for an opportunity that required only moments' violent action to initiate. The men he killed believed they were pursuing property. They died learning they were hunting a human being who decided life as property wasn't life at all, that death was preferable to continued bondage, and that anyone participating in his recapture was an enemy to be eliminated without hesitation or mercy. We condemn him for this, but what else could he do? Submit peacefully to recapture? Return docilely to chains? Beg for mercy from men who'd built their livelihoods on denying mercy to people who looked like him? I think of the locks I taught him to analyze, the mechanisms I showed him how to disassemble, the principles of leverage and force I explained without understanding how he'd apply them. I armed him intellectually and didn't realize it. But someone else armed him morally. Every overseer who'd struck him, every owner who'd sold him, every slave catcher who'd pursued others, every element of the system that treated human beings as livestock. They created something they couldn't control and paid the price for that creation. History will judge Bass Reeves harshly, I suspect. He killed 14 men, most of them with families who grieved their loss. But I wonder if history will judge honestly, if it will acknowledge that those 14 chose to participate in an economic system based on violent subjugation, that they pursued Bass knowing capture meant his return to conditions we wouldn't impose on animals, that they accepted the premise that some human beings exist as property for others to exploit. Bass rejected that premise with violence, yes, but what is slavery itself if not violence made institutional, made respectable through law and custom? I am a simple craftsman, not a philosopher, but I know this. The man I taught blacksmithing possessed intelligence and capability equal to anyone I've known, regardless of color. The system that claimed to own him was based on a lie, that such capabilities didn't exist in people of African descent, that slavery was natural order rather than enforced brutality. Bass destroyed that lie through his actions. 14 men died learning that slaves could think, plan, and execute complex strategies. Thousands more learned it watching his escape. And millions will eventually learn it as this war destroys the institution built on that foundational lie. I am troubled, but I am not surprised. The surprise would have been if someone with Bass's capabilities had remained docile under conditions designed to break the spirit of lesser men. He broke free instead, and I suspect future generations will debate whether he was criminal or freedom fighter, murderer or soldier, monster or hero. I know only that he was human, fully human, and humans confronted with his circumstances will do extraordinary things to survive. Brenner's letter never reached its intended recipient, his brother in Pennsylvania, but its preservation provides insight into how at least one white Southerner processed the cognitive dissonance of recognizing capability and humanity in someone the system defined as property. The question of what happened to Bass after June 1865 has never been definitively answered. The various Bass Reeves who appear in historical records might be the same person living under his chosen name, or different people who happen to share it. The lack of photographs from the Civil War period makes visual confirmation impossible. The absence of detailed physical descriptions beyond height and scars means any reasonably tall black man with whipping scars might have been the Bass Reeves who escaped from Miller County. Some researchers believe Bass deliberately obscured his post-war life, recognizing that his reputation as a killer might attract unwanted attention or revenge attempts. Others suggest he simply disappeared into the anonymity that 4 million freed people enjoyed. No longer property requiring documentation, just one more person trying to build a life in a transformed nation. The most intriguing possibility involves the deputy U.S. Marshal named Bass Reeves, who served in Oklahoma Territory from the 1870s through the early 20th century. This Bass Reeves was legendary in his own right. A lawman who reportedly arrested over 3,000 criminals during his career, killed 14 men in self-defense during that service, and demonstrated tracking abilities and tactical skills that earned him a reputation as one of the most effective marshals on the frontier. The numerical coincidence, 14 men killed during escape from slavery, 14 men killed during career as a lawman, has fueled speculation that they're the same person. The skills required for successful law enforcement on the frontier, tracking, wilderness survival, tactical thinking, ability to make life or death decisions without hesitation, align perfectly with the skills Bass demonstrated during his escape. And the psychology of someone who'd killed pursuing slave catchers might well translate into effective law enforcement in a different context. But the historical record provides no conclusive connection. The marshal named Bass Reeves claimed to have been born in Arkansas and freed during the war, but offered no details about his enslaved life or military service. He deflected personal questions with the same kind of silence that characterized the Bass Reeves who'd escaped from Hutchins' plantation. When asked directly about his past, he reportedly said, "What I did before I took the badge isn't relevant to the work I do now. Judge me by present actions, not past circumstances." Whether they were the same person or not, both Bass Reeves, the escaped slave, and the lawman demonstrated that capability, intelligence, and effectiveness existed independent of the social categories that slavery's defenders had insisted defined human worth. Both challenged assumptions about what black men could accomplish when given opportunity and necessity in equal measure. The legacy of the Miller County incident extended far beyond one man's story. Throughout the post-war South, formerly enslaved people told their children and grandchildren about Bass Reeves, sometimes using his actual name, sometimes calling him the blacksmith, sometimes simply referring to the man who killed 14 and walked away free. The story served as psychological counterweight to the degradation of slavery and the ongoing oppression of Jim Crow. It proved that resistance was possible, that the masterclass wasn't invincible, that one person with sufficient determination could defeat overwhelming odds. For white Southerners, particularly in Arkansas, the story represented a different kind of lesson, a reminder that systems based on violent subjugation create their own resistance, that treating human beings as property generates rage that will eventually find expression, and that underestimating opponents based on arbitrary characteristics like skin color can have fatal consequences. The 14 men who died pursuing Bass made a choice when they accepted the assignment. They chose to participate in a system of human bondage, to use their skills and strength to maintain that system, to pursue someone who decided death was preferable to continued enslavement. They died because they underestimated their target, because they assumed superiority based on race rather than capability, because they entered a competition they didn't understand against an opponent who'd spent 6 years preparing for exactly this challenge. Bass Reeves, whoever he became after the war, left behind a story that couldn't be suppressed, despite the best efforts of those who found it threatening or embarrassing. The documents survived in scattered archives. The memories persisted in oral tradition, and the essential truth remained. One man rejected bondage with such effectiveness that 14 pursuers died in the attempt to recapture him, and the institution of slavery in Miller County, Arkansas, never fully recovered from the demonstration that slaves could think, plan, resist, and win. This mystery shows us that the most dangerous stories, the ones most carefully hidden, most deliberately obscured, most conveniently forgotten, often reveal truths that societies would prefer remain buried. The story of Bass Reeves and the 14 men who died hunting him exposes the violence inherent in slavery, the capability denied by racism, and the terrible price paid when one group of humans decides another group exists only as property. It reminds us that official history often conceals more than it reveals, that the silences in historical records speak as loudly as the documented facts, and that some debts, accumulated through centuries of injustice, are eventually paid in ways that shock the conscience precisely because they mirror the violence that created them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or are there still secrets buried in Arkansas courthouse basements, in family papers that descendants are reluctant to share, in oral traditions that haven't yet been documented? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge our understanding of history, capability, and the human capacity for both oppression and resistance. See you in the next video.